This is outrageous! You can't do this!
The police cruisers rolled onto the gravel boat ramp just as I snapped a chain across the lake gate. Karen Mitchell pointed at me from beside the dock and told the deputies I was blocking HOA access to Old Mill Lake. My lake, my ramp, my only service road. Behind her, residents gathered with coolers, fishing poles, and boat keys, while the neighborhood's summer event stalled before it even started. What Karen did not know was that I controlled the lake access road, the dam maintenance gate, the boat ramp parcel, and the easement filing tied to every legal path into that water. Then the first deputy looked past her at the county marker beside my gate. The wind came off the lake cold and sharp. It smelled like mud, pine needles, and old dock boards baking under the morning sun. Red and blue lights flashed across the water. A base boat bumped softly against the wooden ramp. Karen stood in front of it like she owned the shoreline. That was her first mistake. She thought calling the police would turn my deed into a misunderstanding. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 41 years old, and 3 days earlier I bought Old Mill Lake from a timber company that had been selling off forgotten land around Willow County, Georgia. The listing looked simple. 42 acres of water, 200 acres of surrounding woods, an old stone spillway, 1 gravel road, 1 abandoned mill foundation, quiet land, clean title. I thought I was buying a private fishing lake and a weekend restoration project. Then I found the HOA dock. It sat on the north shore with fresh paint, solar lights, and a sign that read Willow Point residents only. Beside it stood a bulletin board advertising kayak days, fishing contests, and 4th of July fireworks over the water. Nobody had mentioned any of that during closing. So I checked the deed again. Then the parcel map. Then the access road description. The road from the county highway curved through my land before reaching the ramp. The dock sat inside my shoreline boundary. The gate post carried my parcel marker. The HOA sign carried only confidence. I came that morning to secure the property and schedule an inspection of the old dam road. I brought a chain, a temporary notice, and a copy of the purchase file. I did not bring an argument. Karen did that for me. She arrived in a white SUV before I finished locking the gate. Blonde hair, navy blazer, sunglasses too polished for a gravel road. She stepped out and asked who authorized me to close community access. I told her Old Mill Lake was private property now. She laughed. Not loudly. Worse than that. Quietly. Like I had embarrassed myself. Then she called the police in front of everyone. By the time the deputies arrived, a dozen residents had formed a line behind her. Some looked irritated. Some looked confused. One man kept saying his family had used the lake for 20 years. A woman asked whether I was stopping the children's picnic. Karen kept repeating the same phrase. Community easement. Community easement. Community easement. The first deputy took my deed and walked toward the gate marker. Gravel crunched under his boots. He read the number twice. Then he unfolded my county map across the hood of his cruiser. His expression changed before he said a word. Karen noticed. So did I. The lake kept moving behind us, small waves tapping the dock posts. Then the deputy pointed at the access road and asked where Karen's easement paperwork was. Karen stopped smiling. The water suddenly sounded much louder. Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. The deputy waited beside the cruiser with the county map spread across the hood. Sunlight reflected off the windshield and flashed across the gravel road. A few residents stepped closer. Others stopped talking altogether. The only sound was water tapping against the dock pilings. Then Karen cleared her throat. She said the HOA had used the lake for decades. She said everyone knew it belonged to the community. The deputy nodded politely. Then he asked the same question again. Do you have the easement paperwork? The pause that followed felt longer this time. Minnie Hook. Karen looked toward a gray-haired man standing near the crowd. He appeared to be another board member. He shrugged. A woman holding a folding chair lowered it back onto the ground. Nobody seemed eager to answer. The deputy traced a finger. Along the map, the gravel access road curved through my property before reaching the lake. The boundary lines were clear. The parcel numbers matched my deed. He pointed toward the road and asked whether the association had any recorded right to cross it. Karen finally said the documents were probably stored in the clubhouse archives. Probably. That single word changed the mood. The residents noticed it too. Moments earlier she had sounded completely certain. Now she sounded hopeful. There was a difference. Another hook. The second deputy walked over to the gate. He examined the steel post and the survey marker beside it. Fresh orange paint still marked the county reference point. He compared the numbers to my paperwork. Everything matched. A young resident standing nearby frowned. "Wait, are you saying the road is private?" Nobody answered immediately. The question hung in the air. The first deputy folded the map and handed it back to me. Then he looked at Karen. "This appears to be a civil property matter." Her expression tightened. She had expected the deputies to remove me. Instead, they were asking her for documents. The balance of the conversation had shifted. Minnie Hook. A breeze moved across the lake. The smell of pine and damp soil drifted through the shoreline trees. Behind the dock, several boats remained on trailers. Families who planned to spend the day on the water were now standing beside their vehicles, watching a property dispute unfold. A man wearing a fishing hat asked whether the lake might close. Another asked who maintained the boat ramp. Nobody seemed sure anymore. That uncertainty spread fast. I opened my truck and removed a survey packet I had received during closing. The pages crackled in the wind. I handed one copy to the deputy and another to Karen. She scanned the boundary lines. Her eyes stopped near the access road. Then she looked back at the lake parcel itself. For the first time since arriving, she seemed less interested in arguing and more interested in understanding what she was seeing. But something else caught my attention. She was not surprised by the road. She was surprised by a specific notation near the shoreline. Minnie Hook. The gray-haired board member noticed it too. He stepped closer and quietly asked to see the page. Karen hesitated before handing it over. He studied the notation for several seconds. Then his face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough for the deputy to notice. Enough for several residents to notice. Whatever that notation meant, at least one person in the HOA had seen it before. The lake shimmered behind us under the late morning sun. Nobody seemed interested in boating anymore. Then the gray-haired man asked a question that changed everything. Who checked the easement file after the last renewal? The question landed harder than anything Karen had said that morning. The gray-haired board member kept his eyes on the survey page. Nobody answered him. A boat trailer rattled somewhere behind the crowd as a family quietly backed away from the ramp. The deputies exchanged a glance. Even they seemed interested now. Karen folded her arms and looked toward the lake instead of the document. That reaction told its own story. Minnie Hook. What renewal? A resident asked. The gray-haired man looked surprised. You do not know? Several people shook their heads. He tapped the notation near the shoreline boundary. The access agreement was never supposed to run on autopilot. The crowd grew quieter. The first deputy leaned against his cruiser. He was no longer dealing with a simple complaint. He was watching a dispute unfold around paperwork that nobody seemed to fully understand. The gray-haired board member introduced himself as Harold Benson. He had served on the HOA board years earlier. Not recently. Long enough ago that many newer residents did not recognize him. Harold pointed toward the road leading back to the county highway. The road was always the key. That caught my attention immediately. Another hook. I asked what he meant. Harold took a slow breath. The smell of lake water and sun-warmed pine drifted across the shoreline. The lake mattered, he said, but the road mattered more. Several residents frowned. Harold explained that every vehicle, every trailer, every maintenance truck, every emergency crew, and every event supplier reached the shoreline through that single gravel corridor. The same corridor that crossed my property. A woman near the dock looked toward the road and suddenly seemed uneasy. She had probably driven across it for years without ever wondering who owned it. Most people had. Karen finally spoke. She said the HOA had maintained the area for decades. Harold nodded. Maintenance is not ownership. The sentence hung in the air. Nobody challenged it. Minnie Hook. The deputy asked whether there was an easement document on file somewhere. Karen said there should be. Should. Again. That word appeared for the second time. Residents noticed. Confidence was slowly turning into uncertainty. I walked to my truck and retrieved another folder from the passenger seat. During closing, I had requested every survey the title company could locate. Most buyers never bothered. I did. Old properties tend to collect old surprises. The folder contained aerial maps, boundary sketches, and utility references. Nothing dramatic. At least that was what I thought at the time. Harold studied one of the maps. Then he stopped. Completely stopped. His finger rested on a faded line running parallel to the access road. His eyes narrowed. The crowd sensed it immediately. Another hook. Where did you get this copy? He asked. I told him it came from the title company archive. Harold compared it to the survey already sitting on the hood of the cruiser. Then he compared it again. The deputy stepped closer. Karen did too. A faint breeze flipped one corner of the page. Harold held it down with his palm. This line is missing. The deputy frowned. Missing from what? Harold pointed at the newer survey. From this version. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from waves touching the shoreline rocks. Harold traced the faded marking carefully. It appeared to connect the access corridor to an older notation farther uphill. A notation that no longer appeared on the modern survey. Karen looked genuinely confused now. Not defensive. Confused. That was different. Harold looked at me. Then at the deputy. Then back at the map. I think we need the original county file. The deputy nodded. Slowly. So did I? Because whatever had disappeared from that survey seemed important enough that someone once wanted it recorded. The deputies left a few minutes later, but nobody else seemed ready to go anywhere. The lake had become the center of attention. Pickup trucks lined the gravel shoulder. Boat trailers sat idle beneath the sun. Families who came for a Saturday on the water now stood in small groups, discussing surveys, easements, and county records. Harold remained beside the cruiser hood, studying the faded copy of the older map. He looked troubled, not alarmed. Troubled. There was a difference. Minnie Hook. Karen checked her phone 3 times in less than a minute. Then she stepped away from the crowd and made a call. Her voice stayed low. I could not hear the words. I noticed something else instead. She was no longer talking about ownership. She was talking about documents. That shift mattered. Earlier, she had acted completely certain. Now she wanted records. The lake shimmered behind her. Sunlight flashed across the water like broken glass. A heron lifted from the reeds near the shoreline and disappeared across the opposite bank. The morning felt peaceful. The conversation did not. Harold finally folded the old survey and handed it back to me. The county archive is the next stop, he said. Several residents immediately asked why. Harold pointed toward the missing notation. Because things do not disappear from maps without a reason. That answer spread through the crowd fast. Another hook. One resident asked whether someone altered the survey. Harold shook his head. I am not saying that. Then he paused. I am saying I want to know why the notation vanished. That was enough to keep everyone interested. Karen returned from her phone call. Her expression looked different now. More controlled. More careful. She announced that the HOA would hold an emergency board meeting at the clubhouse that evening. Several residents nodded. Others immediately began asking questions. Did the HOA actually have a recorded easement? Had anyone reviewed it recently? Was the lake still available for community use? Karen answered very few of them. That silence created more concern than any answer could have. Minnie Hook. Around noon, most residents finally drifted away. The dock emptied. The parking area thinned. A warm breeze carried the smell of lake water and sun-heated wood across the shoreline. I locked the gate again and walked the access road alone. Gravel crunched beneath my boots. The road curved through tall pines before climbing a low ridge overlooking the water. Halfway up the hill, I found something unexpected. An old metal survey stake hidden beneath weeds. I crouched beside it. The marker was weathered but intact. Someone had placed it there decades ago. The location matched the faded line Harold noticed on the older map. My attention sharpened immediately. Another hook. I followed the alignment uphill. 50 yards later, I found a second marker. Then a third. None appeared on the modern survey. The woods were quiet except for insects humming in the heat. Shafts of sunlight filtered through pine branches overhead. Whatever this corridor represented, it had once been important enough to receive official markers. I photographed each location and sent the images to Harold. His response arrived less than 5 minutes later. 3 words. Do not remove anything. That message raised more questions than it answered. By late afternoon, I drove into town and stopped outside the county records building. The brick structure sat beside the courthouse square. Old oak trees shaded the sidewalk. I checked the posted hours. The archive department had already closed for the day. Frustrating, but not entirely, because another vehicle sat parked near the entrance. Karen's white SUV. I stared at it for several seconds. The engine was off. Nobody appeared inside. Yet there it was. The same vehicle that had been at the lake hours earlier. If the archive office was closed, there was only one reason she would still be there. She was looking for the same file. Karen's SUV remained parked beneath the courthouse oak trees as evening shadows stretched across the square. I stayed in my truck for a moment and watched the building entrance. The archive office was officially closed. The glass doors reflected orange sunlight. Yet Karen's vehicle had not moved. Minnie Hook, a maintenance worker, exited through a side door carrying a trash bag. No one else appeared. After several minutes, Karen finally stepped out of the building. She was not alone. A man in a tan sport coat walked beside her holding a thin document folder. They spoke quietly near the sidewalk. I could not hear the conversation. I could see their expressions. Neither looked relaxed. Karen nodded several times. Then she accepted a single sheet of paper before heading toward her SUV. The man returned inside. That small exchange told me enough. She was already searching for answers. Another hook. I drove away before she noticed me and headed back toward the lake. The road wound through pine forest, glowing gold beneath the setting sun. Cicadas hummed from the trees. Warm air carried the smell of dry grass and lake water. My phone buzzed halfway home. Harold. He wanted to meet first thing in the morning. No explanation. Just a location and a time. That alone made me curious. Harold was not the type to create drama. If he wanted an early meeting, he had found something. The next morning arrived cool and clear. Mist floated above the water when I reached the shoreline. The lake looked peaceful. Too peaceful considering everything unfolding around it. Harold arrived carrying 2 cardboard tubes and a leather briefcase. He spread several oversized survey copies across the tailgate of my truck. The paper edges fluttered in the breeze. Minnie Hook. One survey dated back more than 40 years. Another came from the late 1990s. The third was modern. Harold compared them side by side. The difference became obvious immediately. The faded corridor line I discovered on the hillside appeared clearly on the oldest survey. It remained visible on the second. Then it vanished entirely from the newest version. Harold tapped the location. That is not an accident. I studied the maps again. The corridor connected the access road to a narrow strip running along higher ground. It looked insignificant at first glance. But surveyors do not mark insignificant things repeatedly across decades. Another hook. Harold opened his briefcase and removed copies of old board meeting notes. He had kept personal records from his years on the HOA board. Most people throw those things away. Harold never did. He flipped through yellowed pages until he found a handwritten reference. Then he handed it to me. The note mentioned a renewal review scheduled many years earlier. Nothing detailed, just enough to catch my attention. "Do you see the date?" he asked. I did. The review should have happened. There was no indication it ever did. Harold leaned against the truck and stared toward the lake. Back then, everyone assumed someone else handled it. That sentence sounded familiar. It explained far too many problems. Around mid-morning, we drove into town together and visited the county records office. The building smelled like old paper, dust, and floor polish. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rows of archive shelves stretched into the back room. A clerk helped us locate the original property records connected to the shoreline parcels. Several boxes arrived on a rolling cart. We spent hours opening folders. Most contained routine surveys and transfer documents. Then Harold stopped turning pages. Minnie Hook. He carefully lifted a brittle sheet from one folder. A faded county stamp covered the corner. Attached behind it sat a renewal checklist. My pulse quickened. The checklist contained multiple signature lines. Most were completed. One was not. The blank line sat directly beside the easement continuation section. Harold stared at it for several seconds. Neither of us spoke. The silence inside the archive room suddenly felt very loud. Then the clerk returned carrying another box and said something that made both of us look up. "That is not the only file tied to that agreement." Harold and I looked at the clerk at the exact same moment. The archive room suddenly felt smaller. Rows of records stretched into the distance beneath fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of aging paper hung in the air. The clerk set the second box onto the table with surprising care. "Most people never request this one," she said. That sentence immediately caught my attention. Minnie Hook. Harold removed the lid. Inside sat a collection of older county correspondence tied to shoreline access, maintenance obligations, and historical property agreements. None of it looked dramatic at first glance. Yellow folders, faded labels, routine government paperwork. Then Harold opened the first file. His eyebrows rose slightly. That was enough for me. Harold was not easily surprised. Another hook. We spent the next 20 minutes sorting through letters and renewal notices. Several referenced the same agreement we had already found. Others mentioned inspections connected to the access corridor above the lake. One document contained a detailed checklist. Another referenced annual compliance reviews. The pattern was becoming clear. Whatever easement existed had not been a permanent gift. It came with conditions. Specific conditions. The kind people forget when decades pass. A clock ticked quietly somewhere in the archive office. Outside, distant courthouse traffic drifted through the windows. Harold turned another page and stopped again. This time he handed the document directly to me. A county letter addressed to the HOA board referenced a pending review period. The language was formal, dry, easy to overlook. Yet one paragraph had been underlined years ago in blue ink. Someone had wanted it noticed. Mini hook. The underlined section referred to continuation requirements. Failure to complete review procedures could affect future access rights. Harold read the paragraph twice, then a third time. Neither of us rushed. The details mattered now. The clerk returned carrying a scanning tray and noticed our expressions. "Found something interesting?" she asked. Harold gave a careful answer. "Possibly." The clerk nodded knowingly. "That property has generated questions before." My attention sharpened immediately. Before. Not once. Not recently. Before. Another hook. I asked whether anyone from the HOA had reviewed these records over the years. The clerk checked a digital log. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. A few moments later, she turned the monitor toward us. Several archive requests appeared. Most were decades old. One stood out. Less than 24 hours earlier. Karen Mitchell. Neither Harold nor I said anything. We did not need to. Karen had come searching for the same answers. The question was whether she found them. Harold continued through the files. Near the bottom of the second box sat a thin folder stamped with an older county seal. The paper inside was brittle. The ink had faded. Yet one attachment remained perfectly readable. A renewal checklist nearly identical to the one we had already found. Except this version contained handwritten notes in the margin. Someone had written a reminder beside the continuation section. Review every 10 years. Harold slowly exhaled. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The room felt silent despite being occupied. Mini hook. We compared dates. Then compared them again. The timeline formed piece by piece. Multiple review cycles should have occurred. Some appeared documented. Others did not. A gap emerged. Then another. Harold leaned back in his chair. This is bigger than one missing signature. I thought the same thing. The issue was no longer whether an easement existed. The issue was whether critical renewal steps had quietly stopped happening years ago. The distinction mattered. A lot. By late afternoon, we requested certified copies of every relevant record. The clerk organized the paperwork into a stack nearly 3 inches thick. As she prepared the documents, she paused and glanced toward a separate shelf behind the counter. "There is one more file," she said. "Most people do not know it exists because it was archived under a different property number." Harold and I exchanged a look. Then she disappeared into the back room. We waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, she returned carrying a worn red folder unlike any file we had seen all day. The moment Harold read the label, his expression changed completely. Harold stared at the red folder for several long seconds before opening it. The archive room seemed quieter than before. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt distant. I looked at the label. It carried an older property reference number that no longer appeared in any modern county database. That alone was unusual. Mini hook. Harold carefully opened the cover. Inside sat a collection of correspondence, dating back more than 40 years. Most involved the original mill property before the subdivision existed. Some referenced shoreline maintenance. Others discussed road access and liability concerns. Then Harold stopped turning pages. His hand froze over a single document near the center of the file. I leaned closer. The paper contained a memorandum between county officials and the original developer. The ink had faded, but the wording remained readable. Harold read the first paragraph silently. Then he read it again. Another hook. "This changes the timeline," he said quietly. I immediately asked how. Harold slid the document toward me. The memorandum explained why the access agreement had been created in the first place. The developer wanted residents to reach the lake, but county officials refused to approve unrestricted access without periodic review requirements. That part matched what we already suspected. The next section did not. The continuation process was not automatic. It depended on compliance certifications tied to specific maintenance obligations. If those obligations stopped being documented, continuation could be challenged. I sat back in my chair. The archive room suddenly felt colder. The issue was becoming much larger than a missing signature. Minnie Hook. The county clerk returned with another stack of records and noticed our attention fixed on the memorandum. "You found it," she said. Harold looked up. "Found what?" The clerk pointed toward the document. "That file causes most of the confusion." She explained that several older property numbers had been consolidated decades earlier. During the transition, some records ended up separated from the primary easement file. Anyone reviewing only the modern file would miss important context. That explained a lot. It also raised another question. Had anyone on the HOA board ever reviewed the complete record set? The answer seemed increasingly unlikely. Harold continued through the folder. Several pages later, we found meeting summaries from county review sessions held years ago. Most were routine. Then one note caught my attention. A reviewer had recommended verification of maintenance compliance before the next renewal cycle. Beside the recommendation sat a handwritten notation. Follow-up pending. No completion date appeared anywhere. Another hook. Harold compared the review date to the renewal timeline we had already assembled. The gap matched perfectly. One missing review. Then another. Then another. Decades of assumptions appeared to have filled the space where actual verification should have existed. The pattern was impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, the table in front of us was covered with copies, notes, timelines, and survey maps. The smell of old paper lingered in the air. Outside the courthouse windows, sunlight began fading across the square. We finally organized the documents into chronological order. For the first time, the story became visible. Not complete, but visible. The access arrangement survived because people assumed prior reviews had occurred. Each board inherited that assumption from the board before it. Nobody seemed to question it. Nobody seemed to verify it. Minnie Hook. My phone vibrated. A message from a resident I had met at the lake. Word of the archive search had spread through the neighborhood. Faster than I expected. The message contained a photograph from the emergency HOA meeting taking place that evening. The clubhouse was packed. Every chair appeared occupied. More residents stood along the walls. Karen stood at the front of the room, speaking to the crowd. Her expression looked serious. Very serious. Harold studied the photograph. Then he noticed something in the background. A projector screen. Displayed on it was a document. Not just any document. One we had reviewed earlier that day. Karen had found part of the record. The problem was that she had not found all of it. Then Harold pointed toward the bottom corner of the image and quietly said something that made my pulse quicken. Someone else was sitting beside Karen. Harold enlarged the photograph on his phone and held it between us beneath the fading courthouse lights. The image was grainy, but the man sitting beside Karen was easy to recognize. It was the same man I had seen outside the records building the day before. The tan sport coat. The thin document. Folder. The same person. Minnie Hook. Harold immediately recognized him as well. That is Thomas Reed, he said. The name meant nothing to me. Harold explained that Thomas had worked as a land use consultant for years. Not an attorney. Not a county official. A consultant. Someone people hired when property issues became complicated. That detail caught my attention. Karen had moved beyond assumptions. She was bringing in outside help. Another hook. By the time we left the archive building, the sun had disappeared behind the courthouse rooftops. Streetlights reflected across parked cars. A warm breeze moved through the square. During the drive back toward the lake, I kept thinking about the photograph. If Thomas had only part of the record, his conclusions could be very different from ours. That possibility mattered. Incomplete information had created this entire situation in the first place. The next morning I woke before sunrise and headed toward the property. Low fog hovered above the water. The lake looked almost silver beneath the early light. Songbirds echoed from the pines. Everything appeared calm, yet the dispute seemed to be growing larger by the hour. My phone vibrated before I reached the gate. It was a message from Harold. 3 words. Meeting moved forward. No explanation. Minnie Hook. 20 minutes later, another message arrived from a resident. The HOA board had scheduled a special discussion that afternoon instead of waiting for the next week. Attendance was expected to be high. Word had spread far beyond the subdivision. Some residents believed access would continue without interruption. Others feared the opposite. Rumors filled the gap where facts should have been. By mid-morning, I received an unexpected call from Thomas himself. His voice was professional, calm, direct. He asked whether I would be willing to meet at the clubhouse before the board session. I agreed. Curiosity outweighed caution. Another hook. The clubhouse sat overlooking a grassy common area near the subdivision entrance. When I arrived, dozens of vehicles already filled the parking lot. Residents stood in small groups discussing maps, easements, and county records. The atmosphere felt very different from the confidence I had seen earlier in the week. Questions had replaced certainty. Inside, Thomas sat at a conference table covered with documents. Karen sat across from him. Several board members occupied nearby chairs. Harold arrived a few minutes later carrying copies from the archive. The meeting began quietly. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just paperwork. Thomas reviewed several documents he had obtained. Most matched records we had already seen. Then he reached a conclusion. According to the materials available to him, the easement appeared valid. Karen visibly relaxed. So did several board members. For a moment, the tension in the room eased. Minnie Hook. Then Harold placed the red folder on the table. Every eye turned toward it. Thomas frowned slightly. He had never seen it before. That much was obvious. Harold carefully removed the memorandum, the continuation requirements, and the archived review notes. One by one, he arranged them beside the documents Thomas had brought. Silence settled across the room. Even the residents gathered near the doorway stopped whispering. Thomas began reading. His expression changed slowly. Not because of one page. Because of the sequence. Each document added context to the one before it. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nobody interrupted him. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked toward Karen. The confidence that had filled the room moments earlier was gone. Thomas pointed toward a specific section of the continuation requirements. Then he asked the question nobody wanted to hear. Do we have proof the required renewal reviews actually happened? Karen did not answer immediately. Neither did anyone else. Because for the first time since this began, the room was no longer debating ownership. It was debating evidence. The room stayed silent after Thomas asked the question. Papers covered the conference table. The air conditioner hummed softly above us. Outside the clubhouse windows, residents continued gathering in the parking lot. More vehicles arrived every few minutes. Word was spreading. Minnie Hook. Karen looked down at the documents instead of answering. One board member opened a laptop and began searching through old association records. Another flipped through a binder thick with meeting minutes. Pages turned. Keys clicked. Nobody found anything immediately. Thomas remained patient. He was not arguing. He was waiting. That made the silence feel heavier. Harold folded his hands and watched. I noticed several residents standing near the doorway exchange worried looks. Until now, most people assumed the access question had a simple answer. Suddenly, it did not. Another hook. 10 minutes passed. The board member with the laptop finally spoke. He found references to maintenance projects. He found budget approvals. He found shoreline repairs. What he did not find were completed review certifications matching the continuation requirements. Thomas nodded slowly. He seemed less interested in opinions and more interested in documentation. The distinction mattered. Karen finally spoke. She said previous boards likely handled the reviews. Likely. The same uncertainty had appeared before. Residents noticed it again. A retired accountant sitting near the back raised his hand. He asked a simple question. If the reviews happened, where are the records? Nobody answered immediately. Minnie Hook. The question lingered. Thomas adjusted his glasses and reviewed the timeline Harold had assembled. The dates lined up with the archive documents. Renewal periods appeared. Compliance reviews should have followed. Then the trail grew thin, then thinner. Eventually, it disappeared altogether. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Harold pointed toward one of the archived county notes. A review recommendation existed. A follow-up notation existed. Yet no completion file appeared afterward. Thomas studied the page carefully. That gap concerns me, he said. Several residents shifted in their chairs. The mood inside the clubhouse had changed completely. Earlier, people came expecting a dispute about ownership. Now they were watching an investigation into missing records. Another hook. As the discussion continued, an older resident named Margaret stood from the second row. She had lived in the neighborhood since the early years of development. Her voice was calm. She remembered attending community meetings decades earlier. She remembered hearing discussions about inspections tied to lake access, but she could not recall anyone talking about them after the early years. Several longtime residents nodded. Their memories were similar. The reviews seemed to fade from conversation over time, not because anyone intentionally ignored them. They simply stopped being discussed. Assumptions replaced verification. Thomas wrote several notes. Then he asked whether anyone had contacted the county directly about the continuation requirements. Karen admitted they had not. That answer triggered another wave of whispers across the room. Minnie Hook. Around that moment, my phone vibrated. The screen showed an incoming message from the county records clerk. I opened it quietly beneath the table. The message was short. Very short. A supplemental archive search had located additional correspondence connected to the old property number. My attention sharpened instantly. Attached was a photograph of a document summary page. I enlarged the image. One line stood out. County review status unresolved, pending verification. I showed the screen to Harold. His eyes narrowed. Then he handed the phone to Thomas. The consultant read the summary twice. The room seemed to hold its breath. Thomas placed the phone back on the table and leaned into his chair. For the first time all afternoon, he appeared genuinely concerned. Another hook. Residents immediately sensed the shift. Questions came faster now. Could access rights expire? Did unresolved reviews matter? What would the county decide? Thomas refused to speculate. He remained careful, professional, but his caution spoke volumes. The certainty that existed a week earlier was gone. In its place stood a growing stack of unanswered questions. As the meeting approached its end, Thomas made one recommendation. The county needed to review the complete record set before anyone could make reliable conclusions. Nobody argued. Nobody celebrated. Nobody looked comfortable. Because the issue was now larger than the HOA board, larger than me, and larger than the neighborhood itself. Then Harold received an email. Alert on his tablet, and quietly turned the screen toward us. The county had scheduled a formal records review. The notification changed the atmosphere in the clubhouse immediately. Conversations stopped halfway through sentences. Residents who had been gathering their belongings remained in their seats. Harold enlarged the email on his tablet and placed it in the center of the table. The county had scheduled a formal review of the complete record chain connected to the lake access agreement. Not next month. Not next week. 3 days away. Minnie Hook. Thomas read the notice carefully. Then he read it again. His expression remained professional, but the confidence he displayed earlier was gone. Karen leaned forward and asked whether the review was routine. Thomas took a moment before answering. Not usually. The room became quiet again. Outside, evening light faded across the clubhouse parking lot. Through the windows, I could see small groups of residents still talking beside their vehicles. Word would spread before sunset. Another hook. The meeting ended without a resolution. Nobody had won. The issue now belonged to the county review process. As people filed out, several residents approached me. Their questions were different from the ones I heard at the boat ramp. Nobody accused me of blocking access anymore. Nobody demanded I open the gate. Instead, they asked what would happen if the county found missing compliance reviews. I answered honestly. I did not know. The truth was that nobody knew. That uncertainty seemed to bother people more than conflict ever had. The following morning, the lake looked calm beneath a pale gray sky. Low clouds drifted above the water. A cool breeze pushed ripples toward the dock. I walked the shoreline carrying a folder of survey copies and archive notes. The farther this situation progressed, the more I wanted to understand every piece of the property myself. Minnie Hook. Near the old mill foundation, I noticed tire tracks leading toward the upper ridge. Fresh tracks. They had not been there the previous day. I followed them uphill through the pines. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Fallen needles softened my footsteps. After several hundred feet, I reached the corridor marked by the old survey stakes. Someone had recently visited the area. The disturbed soil made that obvious. Another hook. One of the markers had been cleared of brush. Not removed. Cleaned. I crouched beside it and noticed a small survey flag tied nearby. Bright orange. New. Very new. Someone was tracing the same route Harold and I had discovered. I photographed everything. Then I sent the images to him. His response arrived less than 2 minutes later. I am not the one who placed those. My attention sharpened immediately. If Harold had not returned, someone else had. Around noon, I received another message. This time from Thomas. He wanted to meet at the county building before the formal review. Nothing dramatic. Just a document exchange. We agreed to meet the next day. Mini hook. When I arrived at the courthouse square, Thomas was already waiting on a bench beneath the oak trees. A leather folder rested beside him. The morning air smelled faintly of rain. Traffic moved slowly along the street. Thomas got straight to the point. He handed me several copies of records he had obtained independently. Most matched what we already knew. One did not. The final document contained correspondence between a previous HOA board and county staff from years earlier. The exchange discussed upcoming review requirements. What caught my attention was not the letter itself. It was the date. The communication occurred long after the reviews should have been routine knowledge. Thomas tapped the page. Someone knew this needed attention. Another hook. We sat in silence for a moment. Cars passed through the square. A courthouse clock chimed the hour. Thomas finally looked toward me. The question is whether they followed through. That question followed me all afternoon. By evening, residents were exchanging copies of documents online. Timelines appeared. Theories appeared. Assumptions appeared. Yet one fact remained stubbornly unchanged. Nobody had produced proof that the required reviews were actually completed. As the sun disappeared behind the trees surrounding the lake, Harold called with new information from the archive clerk. Then, he said something that made me stop walking. You need to see what they found next. Harold's voice sounded different on the phone. Not excited. Not nervous. Focused. That alone told me the new discovery mattered. The evening air carried the scent of lake water and damp grass as I stood near the shoreline. The last light of sunset reflected across the surface in long streaks of gold. I asked what the archive clerk found. Harold paused for a second. A transfer packet. Mini hook. That phrase immediately caught my attention. We had already reviewed surveys, renewal files, compliance notes, correspondence, and county memoranda. A transfer packet sounded different. More administrative. More specific. Harold explained that the file surfaced during a secondary search tied to the older property number. It had been stored separately from the easement records. Once again, important information had ended up in a different archive category. I told him I would meet him first thing in the morning. The next day arrived cool and overcast. Gray clouds drifted above the courthouse square. The air smelled faintly of rain. Harold was already waiting inside the records office when I arrived. The red folder sat on the table beside him. So did another stack of copied documents. Mini hook. The archive clerk joined us a few minutes later. She carried a thin binder protected by a clear plastic cover. This is the packet, she said. Harold opened it carefully. Inside were property transition documents from decades earlier. Most appeared routine. Transfer forms. County acknowledgments. Survey references. Then we reached the attachment section. Several pages had been clipped together and marked for review. Harold slowly turned the first page. I immediately noticed a familiar phrase. Easement continuation responsibilities. Another hook. The language was not identical to the documents we had already reviewed. It was more direct, more practical. Instead of discussing requirements in general terms, it outlined who was expected to monitor them after ownership changes occurred. Harold continued reading. Then he stopped. The room felt completely silent. Even the archive clerk seemed interested. Now, a single paragraph identified the responsible party during a transition period many years ago. That by itself was not surprising. The next sentence was, it referenced written notification requirements that should occur whenever responsibility transferred to a new governing entity. Harold compared the paragraph against our timeline. Then he compared it again. The dates aligned perfectly with the period where records began disappearing. Mini hook. The implication was difficult to ignore. If notification procedures were required, documentation should exist. Yet none had appeared anywhere in the archive chain. The clerk helped us search related files. More boxes arrived. More folders appeared. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing them. The smell of paper and dust filled the room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows. Page after page revealed routine administration. But the notification record remained missing. Another hook. Around midday, Thomas arrived for the scheduled county review preparation meeting. Harold immediately showed him the transfer packet. Thomas read quietly for several minutes. Nobody interrupted him. When he finished, he leaned back and looked toward the ceiling. "This creates another question," he said. We all knew he was right. Every answer seemed to produce two new questions. Thomas pointed toward the notification language. If responsibility truly shifted as described, proof of that transfer should appear somewhere. Either the documentation existed or it did not. The county review would likely focus on that issue. The distinction mattered because continuation procedures depended on accountability. Someone had to be responsible. If responsibility became unclear, the entire compliance chain weakened. Mini hook. By late afternoon, the formal county review session finally began. Representatives from county records, planning, and land administration gathered in a conference room. Karen attended. Thomas attended. Harold attended. I attended. Several residents sat quietly along the back wall. Thick binders covered the tables. Survey maps hung from display boards. The atmosphere felt professional. Serious. Nobody seemed interested in arguments anymore. Facts had taken over. The lead reviewer opened the session and summarized the record history. Then he reached the section discussing continuation procedures. The room grew noticeably quieter. He turned several pages, paused, then looked toward another county staff member seated beside him. The two exchanged a brief glance. That was when I realized they had found something we had not yet seen. The glance between the two county reviewers lasted only a second, but everyone in the room noticed it. The conference room suddenly felt smaller. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Papers covered every table. The smell of coffee and old file folders lingered in the air. Nobody spoke while the lead reviewer continued reading. Mini hook. He adjusted his glasses and turned another page. Then he looked toward the planning department representative seated beside him. "Please bring up the supplemental file." The words immediately captured everyone's attention. Supplemental file. Another file. Another record chain. Another piece nobody had discussed before. A laptop screen illuminated near the front of the room. Several documents appeared on the projection display. I recognized none of them. Another hook. Thomas leaned forward. Harold did the same. Karen sat perfectly still. The first document appeared routine. County correspondence. The second showed administrative tracking notes. The third changed everything. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was a simple status report generated during an internal review many years ago. Yet one section immediately stood out. The reviewer had identified uncertainty regarding continuation compliance documentation. The wording was careful, professional, but impossible to ignore. The issue had been noticed before, years earlier. Mini hook. The room remained silent as the county representative explained the timeline. At some point in the past, staff members had recognized gaps in the continuation record chain. They documented the concern internally. Then administrative restructuring occurred. Departments changed. Records migrated. Personnel retired. The concern remained unresolved. Not hidden. Not erased. Simply unresolved. That distinction mattered. Thomas requested permission to examine the document more closely. The reviewers agreed. He studied every page. Harold reviewed copies simultaneously. I watched both of them comparing dates against the archive timeline we had assembled. The pieces were beginning to connect. Another hook. Then the planning department representative displayed a second supplemental record. This one drew immediate attention from everyone present. The document summarized a historical compliance review request. Not a completed review. A request. The difference was important. According to the summary, county staff attempted to verify continuation requirements during a previous cycle. The outcome section contained only a brief notation. Documentation unavailable at time of review. A low murmur spread through the room. Residents exchanged glances. Karen stared at the screen. Nobody seemed prepared for that entry. Mini hook. The lead reviewer remained calm. He reminded everyone that the purpose of the session was fact-gathering, not assigning blame. The county was reviewing records, not people. That statement eased some tension. Still, the implications remained significant. If documentation had been unavailable during a previous review cycle, questions about continuation obligations became difficult to dismiss. Thomas nodded slowly. For the first time since I met him, he appeared less like a consultant and more like a historian reconstructing a forgotten timeline. The evidence was pulling the story in a very specific direction. Another hook. As the afternoon continued, additional files appeared. Most added context rather than surprises. Transfer references, administrative notes, tracking logs. Yet each document reinforced the same pattern. Assumptions accumulated over decades while verification slowly faded. Nobody seemed to have intentionally created the problem. Instead, responsibility became diluted through time. Boards changed. Managers changed. Staff changed. Records moved. Assumptions survived. Documentation did not always survive with them. The lead reviewer eventually organized the evidence into a single timeline displayed across the projection screen. Seeing everything together created a different effect. Individual gaps that seemed small by themselves became impossible to overlook when viewed collectively. Mini hook. Even Karen appeared to recognize it now. Her posture changed. The certainty she displayed at the beginning of this dispute was gone. She no longer argued about ownership. She no longer questioned property boundaries. Instead, she focused on understanding the review chain. The conversation had evolved completely. Residents noticed it too. Questions shifted away from confrontation and toward procedure. What happened next would depend on records, not opinions. The distinction transformed the atmosphere. Near the end of the session, the lead reviewer closed the final binder and looked across the room. Rain continued tapping against the glass. The projector light reflected across stacks of paperwork. Then he made an announcement nobody expected. Based on the supplemental findings, the county intended to issue a preliminary determination. Not months from now. Not weeks from now. Within days. The room became completely silent. Thomas lowered his pen. Harold folded his arms. Karen stared toward the front table. Everyone understood what that meant. The long search through archives, surveys, transfer packets, and forgotten files was approaching an actual conclusion. Then the reviewer opened a sealed envelope that had been sitting beside him all afternoon. The sound of the envelope opening seemed louder than the rain outside. Every person in the room watched the county reviewer remove the document inside. The projector light reflected across the polished conference table. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mini hook. The reviewer unfolded several pages and placed them carefully in front of him. Then he began reading the preliminary determination summary. His voice remained calm and professional. The findings focused on documentation, not assumptions, not traditions, not expectations. Documentation. Years of archived records, transfer packets, review notes, correspondence, and county files had all been examined together. For the first time, the entire record chain had been viewed as one complete timeline. Another hook. The reviewers summarized the key conclusion. Ownership of the lake property was not in dispute. Survey records, transfer documents, and county filings consistently supported the same ownership chain. That issue was settled. The room remained quiet. Then he moved to the continuation requirements. The county found evidence showing that compliance obligations existed throughout the history of the access arrangement. Multiple records referenced them. Multiple reviews attempted to address them. Yet complete documentation proving uninterrupted compliance across every required period could not be verified from the available record chain. The distinction was important. Mini hook. Nobody celebrated. Nobody argued. Residents listened carefully. Karen listened carefully. Thomas listened carefully. Harold sat perfectly still beside me. The reviewer continued reading. Because the documentation remained incomplete, the county would require a formal reassessment process before any future access determination could be considered final. That process would involve updated surveys, current compliance review procedures, and direct coordination between property ownership and community representatives. In other words, assumptions would no longer be enough. Everything would need to be documented properly moving forward. Another hook. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The conflict that had dominated the neighborhood for weeks suddenly felt different. Smaller, less personal, more procedural. The issue was no longer about accusations. It was about rebuilding a record chain that should have been maintained all along. Thomas nodded as the determination was read. Karen remained quiet for several moments. Then something unexpected happened. She stood and addressed the room. No speeches, no dramatic declarations. Just a simple acknowledgement that the board would cooperate with the county process. Several residents visibly relaxed. The tension that had filled the clubhouse meetings seemed to drain away. Mini hook. When the session ended, people slowly gathered their documents and prepared to leave. Rain had stopped outside. Evening sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected across the courthouse windows. Harold and I remained behind for a few minutes reviewing the final paperwork. Years of assumptions had collided with a few forgotten files, a red folder, and a trail of records hidden in separate archives. The outcome was not loud. It was not explosive. It was simply the result of patience and evidence. Another hook. As we walked outside, Thomas caught up with us near the courthouse steps. He shook Harold's hand first, then mine. He admitted that when he entered the situation, he believed the answer would be straightforward. Instead, the records told a far more complicated story that seemed to summarize everything perfectly. The truth had been sitting in filing cabinets, storage boxes, and forgotten archives the entire time. Someone simply had to follow the trail. A week later, the lake looked exactly as it had before the dispute began. Morning fog drifted above the water. Pine trees reflected along the shoreline. Birds called from the old mill ridge. Yet something had changed. The conversations around the community felt different. Residents discussed cooperation instead of confrontation. County staff continued working through the reassessment process. The board focused on documentation rather than assumptions. And for the first time since I purchased the property, people seemed more interested in facts than rumors. I stood on the dock watching sunlight spread across the water and thought about how the entire conflict started. A simple claim, a simple assumption, a simple belief that nobody would ever check the records. In the end, the records told their own story, and that story changed everything.
Enjoying the drama? Consider subscribing for more real stories, where facts matter more than power.